Good evening. All right, I've been sharing with you some reflections on the focus that we're looking at through the focus of radical anthropocentrism. And yesterday, a little bit of interconnectedness. This evening, I'd like to talk a little bit about interdependence. Now, if we think about interdependence, of course, we know what the word means. I think that interdependence flows from interconnectedness. Because we are connected to each other and with each other, we are interdependent. We are dependent upon each other. We are dependent on the natural world. We know that we're dependent upon each other. We're not always sure, or at least I don't think we are always explicitly conscious of the interdependence we have with the rest of the natural world. I use a tree in the backyard. I've said over and over again, elements of the natural world are totally dependent. We are totally dependent on elements of the natural world. We need those trees. We need them for our physical health, and we also need them for touching our creativity and our artistic nature or dimension of our nature. We need them. I don't know if they need us in the same way. And struggling with, the Holy Father speaks about interdependence. And as I was thinking about these things and have been thinking about these things, specifically about interdependence, it is not clear to me how the natural world is physically dependent on us. However, I came to an insight, it's mine, take it or leave it, that from a theological point of view, if we look at the theme, image of God, we've talked about that enough. To be image of God means that we are responsible for the management of the natural world, elements of the natural world. We are responsible for their management. It would seem to me, to that extent, they are dependent on our faithfulness to that responsibility. If we are not faithful to our responsibility to appropriately manage, and we haven't been, sometimes out of greed, sometimes out of ignorance, we didn't know, sometimes out of thoughtlessness, but we have not always managed our responsibility. We have not always done it well. So to the extent that we do it well, or I should say, they are dependent on us to the extent that we will do it and do it well. Because we can harm them. We can harm elements of the natural world. And I said, we have so often done that and continue to do that. Sometimes we're caught in a bind. Unless you got a goat out in the backyard, if you want milk, it's going to come in a container. And what are the containers made of? And are they always usable, reusable? Or if you want to eat meat, you're not going to buy the whole animal and take your time just chopping off the necessary pieces. No, it comes packaged in plastic. And the plastic then is packaged in plastic. And then they put it in a plastic bag. We're caught. We're caught in continuing, the exploitation or at least the pollution of the world. We're caught in it as eco-sensitive as we would like to be. We're trying to get better, but we are caught in it. So we continue, to thwart the interdependence and the interrelationship. But I want to say that once we recognize the responsibility, the privilege and responsibility we have to appropriately manage the world within which we live to the extent we need to. A lot of questions about, do we need the speed of development that we are in this world? I mean, really, how often do we need to get an upgrade in our computers? How often, really? Or in our telephones, or in any kind of technology? We'll say we need it for our work. Well, it makes it more convenient. There's that word again. So there are a lot of people sensitive to echo questions that really question whether or not we need that. And to put in very simple terms, privileged and prosperous nations sin by overconsumption. Again, that is the struggle. I mean, how much stuff do we really need? How many pairs of shoes does a person need? I'm not suggesting, that we have to look at Imelda, a Filipino who had, rooms of shoes, Marcus. But how much do we really need? And we should struggle with that. Those of us who took the vow of poverty. And a lot of people question whether we should even use that word. We have what we need. We have more than we need. When we never have to really give it up. I always say, everything I have belongs to the community. And that's true. But they better not ask for it back. So you know what I mean? And it is a struggle. It is a struggle. So the question is not a question of poverty. It really is justice. It's eco-justice, how much, we need, how much we use, how much we throw away. So that is the underside of not the interrelationship or interdependence. That's the negative underside. Did you watch the news? All of those, where did I write that down? I wrote it down somewhere here, I think I did. First of all, it's news about the virus. Now, where did the virus come from? I mean, whether you think the virus came from a laboratory or it just came from nature, many people, I know nothing about this, I'm just repeating what I have heard, people who know much more about this than I do. Many people believe that it is human responsibility for having created the circumstances for it to explode, and human responsibility for creating the circumstances for its spread. So once again, that's the underside of interdependence. It is dependent on us, and look what we've done. Constantly threatened by tornadoes. What causes a tornado? Movement of air and heat. And we have been very influential in changing the movement of air because of heat. The world is warmer. Warmer weather has the melting of the icebergs, of the glaciers, which rises then, the rivers and the oceans rise. And that causes changes in climate. Now, we may think that we individually did nothing to cause that, but it's always a relationship and a connection. I'm sure you've heard about what they refer to as the butterfly element. It sounds poetic that when a butterfly flaps its wings on the other side of the world, it changes our weather. That's not poetry, that is science. Our actions affects something, that affects something, that affects something, that affects something. We learned that in kindergarten. This is the horse and the hound and the horn that belonged to the farmer sowing his corn. Remember that? That kept the rooster that crowed in the morn, that woke the judge all shaven and shorn, that married the man all tattered and torn, that kissed the maiden all forlorn, that milked the cow with the crumpled horn, that tossed the dog, that worried the cat, that chased the rat, that ate the cheese, that lay in the house that Jack built. All connected. One affects the other, affects the other, affects the other. We're all complicit in this. Don't worry about original sin being a mark on your soul or a black spot in the milk bottle. Remember the milk bottle. Venial sin is only spots. Mortal sin, the whole milk bottle is black. It's a good image for children to understand. We don't have to worry about that. We are immersed in it. Not mortal sin, but certainly original sin. Sin that we can't get out of. It's pretty much a definition of original sin. The effects of sin that we cannot get out of. So talk about interdependence. Again, I want to say, to the extent that we work to be faithful to our responsibilities as caretakers, as stewards, as managers of God's world, to that extent we are faithful. To that extent we are righteous. And we're learning more and more and more about this because we have been separated, frequently separated from that. And also because our spirituality, since maybe about the 18th, 19th century for sure, has been looking into my own soul and saving my soul, which is very interesting because think again of the image of the fire. You don't save yourself. We never save ourselves, right? So we were focused on ourselves rather than realizing we are a community, and not just us, but everything belongs to the community of life, or the community of earth, or the community of the universe. And it teaches us just as we teach each other. So when you look at Laudato Si and find, as you read it through, and come across when the Holy Father's talking about interdependence, think of this. Think of how totally we are dependent physically on the natural world. And the natural world, elements of the natural world, because we are image of God, to use theological language, because we are creatures with intelligence and free will, and we are self-reflective, to use more psychological or physical language. For those reasons, we have a kind of power over, I don't like that word, responsibility for the natural world. We function in the natural world in relationship to them in that way. And to be poetic, in gratitude, it feeds us and houses us and comforts us and inspires us, all free of charge. Look what the world does for us, free of charge. I want us to look for just a little while at something in the prophet Hosea. Prophet Hosea was a northern prophet and had a difficult time with his wife, to put it mildly. The text tells us she was a prostitute. It doesn't tell us what kind of a prostitute. We don't know. We get a sense she probably was a cult prostitute. And I say that because there's so much about cult in this particular prophecy or in this book. Cult prostitute presumes fertility cults. There we are in the natural world again, and the power of life. Fascinating, the powers of life. And all people know, in order to survive, you've got to keep life alive. In order to survive, you've got to make sure that the feminine element, whether it be in the family, in the land, in the crops, in the herds, there has to be fertility. So how do you get fertility? Well, in the ancient world, in order to, first of all, fertility in life is always a divine characteristic because we're dealing with life. And life is in the hands of the gods, not in mortals. All right? And so people had to devise some kind of ritual so that they could plead with the god of life or the god responsible for fertility, because in a polytheistic society, there would be more than one god. But plead with that god to assure the people that they would be fertile. Think of the story about the seal. Except the issue now is specific, it is fertility. And the way you did it was you have sex with a god. So most of the prostitutes were female prostitutes. So somebody, and it would be usually the man would go to the fertility cult, have ritual sex with the priestess, and in that way hope that fertility would come into his body, because it was, I don't even know, when did science know that fertility does not simply come from the male? I'm not quite sure, but they used to think that the female was simply the container. They knew nothing about fertility, the force of fertility in the woman's egg. All they knew was the sperm was fertile, and so fertility was lodged in the male. And so then the man would go and have sex and hope that the power of fertility would come into his body. So she would have been a prostitute in that way. Again, though it doesn't say that, the text itself is one about fertility cults. So for him it becomes, now he's an Israelite, and the presumption is she is as well. Maybe not in origin, she may not have been, but he certainly is an Israelite. And the issue with sacred prostitution is not sex. That's not the real issue. The issue is you're going to the wrong God. It is idolatry. That's the issue. And we see that very clearly in what we find in Hosea. So she is condemned because she's working for the wrong God. And of course, the God of Israel is life in itself, does not need a partner. Now, please appreciate, that's a pretty sophisticated idea for Israel to come to. Because all of the neighbors around, and I've already talked about Israel as not having an extraordinarily high culture, as we found in Mesopotamian cultures like the Syrians, the Babylonians, or in Egypt, or other cultures around it. So that's an extraordinarily sophisticated theological insight, that all life is found in one God, and in fact that there is only one God. Monotheism does not happen overnight, and you don't logically come to it in a lifetime. It takes a long time for these theological insights to come and then be accepted. So the condemnation of her, and this is poetry, of course. When the prophet is speaking, when Hosea is speaking, the way the poetry is articulated, we're not sure. Is he talking about himself or is he talking about God? In other words, the relationship between Hosea and his wife, her name was Gomer, the relationship between Hosea and Gomer becomes a kind of metaphor for the relationship between Israel that runs after other gods. Israel was not always monotheistic. And even when Israel claimed monotheism, was not always faithful. So it becomes a metaphor for the relationship between Israel that runs after other gods and Yahweh. So when we read this, are we talking about Hosea or are we talking about God? And it's so well articulated, it doesn't make any difference which one we're talking about, because we're probably talking on two different levels, or the poet is talking on two different levels. So here's the male saying to his children, plead with your mother, plead, for she's not my wife. That's divorce. Marriage is contracted by word. Divorce was contracted by word as well. This is not my wife, and now they're divorced. She's not my wife, I'm not her husband. That she put away her whoring from her face and her adultery from between her breasts, or I will strip her naked and expose her as on the day she was born, and make her like a wilderness, barren. Always remember, the theme here is fertility. Fertility of what? Everything. Just fertility. Oh, wait, sorry. The woman persists, and this is what she says, I will go after my lovers who give me my bread and my water, my wool, my flax, my oil, and my drink. So the man pleads, have her change her ways or she'll suffer the consequences. Because the presumption is, as we read that the man is in charge of the fertility, of the fruits of fertility. In response, God replies, she did not know. Now she said, I will go after my lovers who give me bread and water and wool and flax and oil and drink, everything. She did not know that it was I who gave her the grain, the wine, the oil. I who lavished upon her silver and gold, which she used for Baal. Therefore, the only way she's going to realize that I was the one who gave it is to take it away. Therefore, I will take back my grain in its time and my wine in its season. I will snatch away my wool and my flax, which were to cover her nakedness. She will then respond as in the days of her youth, as on the day when she came up from the land of Egypt. Of course, that's Israel. On that day, the oracle of the Lord, you shall call me my husband. And that's then Gomer or Israel returning. The woman repents, and God renews the covenant band. And we've talked about covenant. Most likely, you interpret it how you hear it. I will make a covenant for them on that day with the wild animals. Sounds like Genesis 9. I will make a covenant with the wild animals, with the birds of the air, and with the things that crawl on the ground. The bow and the sword and warfare I will destroy from the land. And I will give them rest in safety. I will betroth you to me forever. A lot of people use this phrase for religious profession. Some people in the community used to do that without realizing the context in which this phrase, which is very, romantic, except the context is, after she has violated the commitment, I'm the one that forgives. I will betroth you to me forever. I will betroth you to me in justice and with judgment, with loyalty and with compassion. I will betroth you to me with fidelity, and you shall know the Lord. On that day I will respond to the heavens, and they will respond to the earth, and the earth will respond to the grain and the wine and the oil, and these will respond to Jezreel. Jezreel is a field in Israel where one of the bloodiest battles was fought in Israel. Now, what point am I trying to make with all of this? I think, first of all, without getting too negative, recognizing we have seriously offended a relationship that we have with the world, with the earth, which means with God. And as I say, sometimes deliberately, sometimes I doubt whether the average person realized the consequences of the action. I doubt whether we knew when we were throwing stuff away that we shouldn't be throwing it away. I doubt whether, the plastic is very convenient. And when we were, joyfully experiencing the convenience of having everything plastic, I doubt whether we realized the consequences of that. I doubt whether we realized when we threw garbage away, the way we used to throw garbage away. Now we separate everything. Can be a burden. But the consequences of not separating them is a real burden. Again, part of the problem is a problem that the West has, the Western civilization has. Eastern cultures and traditional cultures don't have it in the same way as we do. And what I'm talking about is we're concerned about our generation, maybe the generation of our children and grandchildren, but seldom much more than that. And the Native Americans, as I recall, when they enter into a serious decision, consider how this will affect the next 7 generations. Some tribes, I think, say 5. But they concern the next 7 generations. The concern is intergenerational. Ours is not like that. And part of that is because of individualism. And not that we are such cold-hearted people. We're no cold-hearted than anyone else. We're just as warm-hearted and sometimes more warm-hearted than a lot of other traditions or civilizations. But so much of that was ignorance, which now we are suffering the consequences, not just of what we've done, but what those ahead of us did. I remember we used to laugh about Lady Bird. She was committed to get all those car junkyards out of the United States, and she was successful. When was the last time you saw a car junkyard? I don't mean a junkyard. I mean an official junkyard. But they used to be on the side of the road or in fields. And where there's one junk car, you can put another junk car. We don't do that anymore. So, we have become aware of certain things. And every little bit counts. But again, we're suffering the consequences not only of our, I want to say ignorance, our lack of understanding the consequences of some behavior. And unfortunately, we did not always listen to people who sounded the bell of alarm. For a long time in our lifetime, people who were committed to ecology were considered kooks. I make a joke about the tree hugger, all right? But and sometimes we're not talking about people who really hug trees, though some people did, because they didn't want them cut down. And there's a reason that they should not be, perhaps be cut down. But we used to make fun of them. They're sort of kooky. Or the first one that drove an electric car. Or composting. Now it's a sign of being hip to compost. But it wasn't always in our lifetime. So we have made tremendous progress, but it's a drop in the ocean compared to what we have to do. And sometimes we may have to give up what is very precious to us because we can't do that anymore. Well, we have 2 years of that, haven't we? And realizing, we at least had some sense of what might happen if we didn't conserve. So, talking about this, what our responsibility is to discover more and more how can we contribute to make the world better. And that's not even a good word, I don't think. To enable the world, the natural world, to regenerate itself. Because it does that. And again, I want to recall what I said, at the beginning of COVID, when people were not out on the roads or at the canals in Venice, the water was clear. And the air in Los Angeles, the small capital of the country, was some of the clearest air in the country. And it didn't take 10 years for that to happen. It tells us, in a certain sense, how quickly we can destroy, but also how quickly we can move back and allow nature to regenerate itself. Part of the regeneration of woods is to let it burn. That's another thing we're suffering from now. And part of it is not simply the natural combustion, but the land is so dry because of the change in the air. Or the land is not being held down by trees that have been cut down so that I got a view of the Pacific Ocean. All right? So in a very real sense, we have been involved in this and we are learning. We are learning. We have much to be proud of, we in the congregation have much to be proud of for the solar panels, taking a step in that way. And the conservancy that we are involved in. We have much to be proud of. The recycling that we're involved in. And the better we get at it, the more often we will realize changing in our shopping. There are certain things maybe we shouldn't eat. So we change our shopping. The idea of buying local produce. Not simply because, it's convenient and that it helps the local people. It does that, of course. But that also means it's not trucked across the United States with all of the combustion that comes along with the trucking. So we're learning more and more and more about that. That is interdependence in a certain sense. As we become more and more conscious of our privilege and responsibility as image of God, we will get better at this. We will live healthier lives. I don't know if you and I will see it happen. It takes a long, long time for that change of thinking, because we are so used to convenience. That ought to be, on our money. That, whether we use that word or not, that is so significant in the lives. And it's preached to us all the time. The ads on television talk about convenience. Beautiful ads. I mean, where these people live, I would love to live like that. And you'll have this kind of a lifestyle with this kind of medicine. And then, however, these are the side effects. If this happens, or this happens, or this happens, and it could cause death, I realize by law they have to say that. Otherwise, they wouldn't. And we get just, sucked into wanting that kind of a lifestyle, wanting that kind of health. That happens. We can thank, commercials for that. And I hope nobody's got a family member who works in commercials, because I don't want to insult anyone. But we are, we're patsies in so many ways. We have to become astute, a little bit more astute. And we have to elect people who are, even though being more astute might cost us more money. All right? So rather than save the money so that you have a beautiful casket. Use the money in a different way by supporting what will give better life. All of that, I think, is part of what it means to be interdependent. But notice it's in a different field. It's not simply in the scientific, but it also has to do with a spirituality, an eco-spirituality, or a green spirituality. It's called a lot of things. And we are so fortunate. Number one, we know about it. Think about your friends and family members who aren't even aware of this, and whether or not you should even bring it up in conversation. But we know about it. We also have opportunities to practice it. If we were really poor, as I said before, the sin of the privileged is consumption. The sin of the underprivileged is overpopulation and destruction of land. And all of it has to do with, those two differences have to do with an unequal distribution of goods. And those are not my categories. That's pretty common categories. So in a certain sense, no one is free of sin. That's a hard word to use, but I think it's important that we use that word every once in a while. Otherwise, we won't realize how serious this is. So, think of the house that Jack built. Think of the house that God built. The house that God built. And that's the world. And this affects this, affects this, affects this. The butterfly in the rainforests in the Amazon affect our weather. You already know what I think about the term bad weather. It affects our weather. And to be ecologically conscious, we are forced by nature to adjust to weather. We cannot make weather adjust to us. So there are certain things that we must adjust to. Maybe there are some things that, again, losses, whether that be a loss in life, human life, losses in fertility in the land, whatever it is, the consequence of our actions. Two phrases I want to leave with you this evening. One of them is, Earth never forgets. Earth never forgets. Whatever we do, we leave a mark. And Earth never forgets that. If we pour toxins in the earth, it'll take only so much and it'll give them back to us. If we put toxins in the air, same thing. Earth never forgets. That's a scientific statement. And another thing, however, is, and I find this interesting, I've got to think more about it. The universe loses nothing of value. The universe loses nothing of value. Somehow it is contained. It's something very similar to the earth never forgets, except it's broader. It includes the universe. Very much the same. It's stored someplace. And like a sponge, in a certain sense, it can only hold so much, and then it gives it back. It gives back good, what we would consider good, what we would consider blessing, and it gives back other things as well that's not so good. Consequently, I said earlier, I do not subscribe to the idea that, natural disaster is God's punishment for sin. If anything, it's Earth getting back at us. And again, I use that lightly, but natural disaster, frequently we are somehow responsible for it. Again, maybe not directly, but human beings have changed the weather patterns, and human beings continue to change the weather patterns. There are some scientists that would say that there are some things we have gone beyond the line of no return. For sure, with extinction, any species that is extinct will never come back, never. So it doesn't repeat itself, but it never forgets. So think of that. Earth never forgets. It holds what we have given it. To that extent, it is dependent on us to give it the right things, because we are dependent on it. There you've got interdependence.